They swept down from the mountains like a torrent and roared over the land. Half man they seemed, half beast. As wild as the hills they emerged from. In battle, none were more reckless, none more fearless. So terrible did they appear that their foes might turn and run before a blow was struck. They fought for nothing less than victory and mocked death itself. "390 BC, a Celtic army marches to battle. A hunger for land, a craving for booty, pushes them on mile after mile. No obstacle, natural or human, hinders the wild men of Western Europe. Their enemy, the small young state called Rome, has never met such a foe. Much later, the historian Livy would record their coming with alarm, too late for his countrymen.
A strange foe of whose power Rome knew nothing was on the march from the Atlantic Ocean and the farthest shores of the world. They flamed into the uncontrollable anger characteristic of their race and set forward with terrible speed on the path to Rome.
The Celts' exploits would be handed down by their victims, the Romans. They left no records of their own. Of their lives before, little is known. But by the 4th century BC, Europe was covered by a mosaic of Celtic tribes. Loosely joined by language, custom, and belief, the clans came to blows with one another over land, or wealth, or simply pride. Throughout the countryside, poor families tilled the soil on behalf of a nobleman. In return for a share of their harvest, they received the protection of his sword. Each Celtic tribe was led by a king and his chieftains, yet they could make no decision without the assembly of nobles, the men who held power, since they were the men who fought. In peacetime, they quarreled and dueled among themselves without cease. In time of war, they were invincible. At the end of the 4th century BC, a group of such men was called upon to gather their goods and their families and head south to Italy. There they would make new homes.
The king, wishing to relieve his kingdom of the burdensome excess of the population, announced his intention of sending his 2 nephews, both of them adventurous young men, out into the world to find such new homes as the gods by signs from heaven might point the way to.
There were plenty of adventurous young men to make the journey. From childhood, the sons of noblemen were taught the ways of war.
Fathers do not allow their sons to approach them openly until they have grown to an age when they can bear the burden of military service.
The king's nephews had grown up with swords and spears and shields. Together, the youths of the tribe had trained and hunted, feasted and drunk. Now, together, they would fight.
They set out with a vast host, some mounted, some on foot, and reached the foot of the Alps. Those sky peaks into another world. These they crossed. They defeated the Etruscans and founded the town of Mediolanum.
Mediolanum, later to be called Milan, was one of many settlements carved out of the land of the Etruscans. Boasting of their courage, feasting on glory, the Celts dared anyone to challenge them in their new homeland. The challenge went unanswered. In battle, the Celts feared no man. They trembled only before their gods. A superstitious people, tribes followed their own deities. Though Lu, god of the sun, was worshipped by all. For a Celt, there was no hell, simply death and certain rebirth in a glorious afterlife. To a warrior who believed he would rise from his grave like the phoenix, death held no terror. The unfortunate Etruscans, fearful of their own mortality at the hands of the Celts, sought help from a neighbor to the south, a small city-state named Rome. The Romans sent north an army several thousand strong, confident they could expel the invader.
The Roman army had covered hardly 11 miles before it met the invaders, where the river Allia descends in a deep gully from the hills. The ground in front and on both sides was already swarming with enemy soldiers.
The Celts dressed in brightly colored tunics and checkered cloaks. Round their necks, they wore richly patterned torques. On their bodies, armbands, rings, jewels. As artists, these pagans were unequaled. Their ornate designs would reappear in another age, on the pages of the Gospels. The superstitious transformed into the sacred. Most warriors entered battle armed with only a spear and a shield. Some spearheads measured up to 20 inches in length. Others had undulating blades to mangle flesh. A nobleman's greatest weapon was his sword. Crafted by skilled blacksmiths, it was sturdily forged, not for thrusting, but slashing. Over time, swords were made even larger, up to 3 feet long. The finest swords, the privilege of the wealthiest men, were studded with precious stones to awe a foe from afar. Up close, their length and strength made a fearful impression. Before battle had even begun, the Celts could terrify their enemy into flight by their very appearance. A tall race of men, half naked, screaming and thrashing, their hair smeared with lime to stand up in spikes. They looked to the Romans like apparitions from the underworld. Even their helmets seemed the work of demons.
On their heads, they wear bronze helmets with large projecting figures, lending the appearance of enormous stature to the wearer.
Near the river Allia, the Celts gathered, more mob than army. Though motley in dress, they were united by their battle standards, animals of the forest and birds of prey. Whipping themselves into a frenzy, the warriors raised their terrible cries, broke into chants, and sang hymns of war. Now and then, a lone Celt would step forward and dare an opponent to fight. Above the din, the Romans heard the fearsome call of the Carnix, the Celtic battle horn.
The Roman commanders had taken no precautions. They drew up their line on as broad a front as they could, hoping not to be outflanked by the enemy's superior numbers. But the hope was vain.
Brennus, the Gallic chieftain, sized up the Roman army. Outnumbered, outflanked, unnerved. He ordered his men to attack. Every man threw himself into the fray.
The Celts overran all the ground, in front and on both sides. At the first sound of the Gallic war cry, the legionaries fled in panic, so blinded to everything but saving their skins, hardly waiting even to see their strange enemy from the ends of the earth. None fell fighting. They were cut down from behind as they struggled to force a way to safety through the heaving mass of their fellow fugitives. Near the bank of the river, there was a dreadful slaughter. The whole left wing of the army had gone that way and had flung away their arms in a desperate hope of getting over. Many could not swim, and many others, in their exhausted state, were dragged underwater by the weight of their equipment and drowned. The Celts could hardly believe their eyes. For a while they stood, rooted to the spot, hardly realizing what had happened. Then, after a moment of fear, lest the whole thing were a trap, they began to collect the arms and equipment of the dead.
As night fell, the Celts, victorious again, made camp. Nothing stood between them and the spoils of war. The rich city of Rome. The next day, the Celts stormed through the city gates. No Roman came out to resist them. The citizens had barricaded themselves on a hill within the capital. The wild men of Europe gazed dumbstruck at sights they had never beheld, high temples and grand buildings. Then they turned to plunder.
For the Romans, the full horror was almost too great to realize. Fate had made them spectators of the nightmare stage scene of their country's ruin.
The Celtic leader Brennus strode up to the senators at the capital and delivered an ultimatum. Pay a ransom and his men would leave. If not, the nightmare the Romans were living would seem merely a dream next to what would follow. The citizens brought gold and jewels to be tallied up, then complained at the way the booty was being weighed. Brennus is said to have added his heavy sword to the scales and declared, "Vae victis," woe to the conquered. When the tribute had been paid, the Celts were true to their word. They marched away. It was a mistake they would regret. Northern Italy now belonged to the Celts. A stream of invaders flowed into the vast plain of the Po River. The Romans themselves acknowledged the new inhabitants by calling the region Gallia Cisalpina, Gaul this side of the Alps. Within a century after the battle by the river Allia, the Celtic world reached its zenith. Those called Gauls by the Romans would leave their mark throughout Europe. Galicia in Spain, Galatia in Turkey, Galicia in Poland. After their defeat in 390 BC, the Romans set about restoring their city, building their army, and biding their time. In 225 BC, almost 2 centuries after their triumph at the river Allia, a huge Celtic army from all over northern Italy and beyond again threatened Rome. 50,000 infantry and 20,000 horses and chariots confronted a Roman force sent to stop them and swept it aside. 80 miles from the capital, the Celts halted. 2 Roman legions, 8,000 strong, blocked their path. Satisfied with the booty they had plundered, the Celts this time turned back. This time, the Romans followed. Unknown to the Celts, another Roman army had appeared behind them, occupying a hill near the village of Telemon and cutting off retreat. Beset on 2 sides, the Celts deployed back to back and prepared to fight in both directions.
The Romans were on the one hand encouraged by having caught the enemy between their 2 armies, but on the other hand they were terrified by the fine order of the Celtic host and the dreadful din. Very terrifying too were the appearance and the gestures of the warriors in front.
The battle was as fierce as the Celts themselves, but this day, reckless bravery and hard steel would meet their match. When the enemies first clashed 2 centuries before, the Romans had carried small, round shields that proved useless against the great slashing swords. Now, each Roman was protected by a shield almost as long as his body. The Romans had learned something more: how to stop the Celts' wild charges. The answer was the javelin. Against the lightly armored Celts, this missile proved deadly. The Celts who survived the barrage were shoved back by the large shields of the Romans. Herded together, the Celts had no room to swing their long swords. From behind a wall of shields, the Romans thrust their newest weapon, a short blade, into naked flesh.
The main body of Celts met the enemy and kept up a stubborn hand-to-hand combat. For though being almost cut to pieces, they held their ground, equal to their foe in courage and inferior only in their weapons.
The Romans recorded that 10,000 Celts were captured. 40,000 were killed. The wild men of Europe had been broken.
This success encouraged the Romans to hope they would be able to entirely expel the Celts from the plain of the Po. A war which, if we look to the desperation and the daring of the combatants, and the numbers who took part and perished in battle, is second to no war in history.
In the next century, Rome grew only stronger as the land of the Celts shrank. Disunited, outfought, the Celtic tribes, one by one, were overwhelmed. By the end of the 1st century AD, the Celts had been driven from Italy, from Gaul, even from England. The tribes who once held Rome in their grip were pushed back to the place they had come from. The lands described by the Roman historian Livy, the farthest shores of the world.
A 1,000 years after the death of Christ, Ireland fights for its life against pagans from the north, Vikings. Outnumbered, the Irish put their faith in one man, a fanatical warrior destined to become a king, and then a legend. Before the last battle is over, Ireland will know unity and treachery in the same moment. In the 10th century AD, as the chroniclers record, Christian Ireland is plagued by heathens from Scandinavia, the Vikings.
They ravaged Ireland's churches and sanctuaries and destroyed her relics and books. They killed Ireland's kings and chieftains and champion warriors. They enslaved our women, taking them over the broad green sea.
On the coast, the Vikings built thriving strongholds: Limerick, Waterford, Dublin. Irish monasteries are plundered, Irish people massacred, and Irish land seized. Pushed inland, the Irish find protection behind traditional defenses, crennaghs. Built on an island in a lake, such a dwelling can be approached only by boat or a narrow causeway. Vikings are not the only enemy to guard against. Ireland is a country at war with itself. In name, it has one king. In practice, rival kingdoms: Leinster, Ulster, Connacht. And in each kingdom, tribal chiefs wage wars within wars. In the year 941, a child is born into one such warring tribe, the Dalcash of Munster. Though he's the son of a chief, Brian Boru seems destined for obscurity. The youngest of 12 brothers, he is unlikely to ever take his father's place as head of the tribe. Much to Brian's disappointment, he is sent off to school at the monastery of Inishfallen. Centers of not only learning, but wealth, monasteries are rich targets for Viking raiders. Yet the only way into these great towers is by ladder, 12 feet up. Within these peaceful confines, Brian is taught Latin and the ancient traditions of Ireland, the Brehon laws, the oldest in Northern Europe. One day, perhaps he will lead his people as an abbot or a bishop. When the boy is 10, one of his kinsmen unexpectedly appears at the monastery. He brings terrible news. In a battle against the Vikings of Limerick, Brian's father has been killed. The tragedy will change the boy's life and earn him a place in history. Brian returns home, his hatred of the Vikings now fueled by revenge. Safe within his family rath, a fort ringed by a ditch and palisade, Brian learns the skills the monks have neglected to teach him: how to fight. Veteran warriors train the boy for combat, with weapons and without, using the Irish arm lock. Brian's elder brothers may have more strength, but not more persistence. Together they play games like hurling and kickball, a sometimes bloody brawl not with a ball, but a stone. The real test of manhood, as tradition has it, is to kill a man. One of the wild men from the neighboring kingdom of Connacht. Inspired by tales of Irish heroes, Brian longs for the day when he can drive the Vikings from his land. Instead, as he grows, Brian sees the tribes of Munster fall one after another to the Vikings of Limerick. Rather than suffer the same fate, Brian's brother, now chief of their tribe, decides to make peace with the Vikings. But Brian still seeks to avenge his father's death. At 21, he leads a small band of followers into the hills of Munster to carry on the fight alone. In pitched battle against the Vikings, his handful of warriors stands no chance. Brian's men will rely on guerrilla tactics, trusting in their speed on foot and their skill with their weapons. Their favorite is the tuacoa, or iron battle axe. So powerful is this weapon that a visitor to Ireland would later observe,
the whole thigh of a soldier, though cased in well-tempered armour, hath been lopped off by a single blow of the axe.
In their other hand, they carry a javelin, a weapon they've grown up using against deer, now turned against Vikings. The native Irish sword is the cleof, a short 2-foot blade worn at the hip. Each warrior trains to wield it in either hand. Some even carry two into battle, slashing right and left. The lucky few wield Viking swords, obtained in trade or by stripping the dead in battle. They live like the heroes in the sagas of Brian's childhood, always on the move, taking shelter in caves, eating whatever they can glean by hunting or raiding. Sweeping down on an outpost or luring a garrison into the forest, Brian's ragtag army takes its toll on the Vikings. Battle takes its own toll on Brian. In such a small band, each casualty is a defeat he can't afford, as his scribe records.
Great were the hardships Brian endured. Bad food and bad bedding on the wet, noddy roots of his own country. It is said that the foreigners killed many of his followers so that only 15 survived.
In the year 964, when Brian's army is on the verge of extinction, his fortunes turn. Emboldened by his lone stand against the Vikings, Brian's brother decides to join him. Not only is the Dalcash tribe behind Brian, young nobles from throughout Munster flock to his side. In the struggle against the Vikings, this band, a few hundred strong, will form the core of his army. They serve not because they have to, but because they wish to. Brian has proven himself a leader. In return, he will reward his followers with the spoils of battle. Brian's warriors are still not as strong as the Vikings of Limerick, but they may be more crafty. One day in 968, Brian sends out a raiding party to bait the foe. Confident in their numbers, the Vikings leave the safety of their fortress in pursuit. On a small rise called Sulkid, the rest of Brian's army lies in wait. What they lack in strength, they will make up for with surprise. The Vikings march deeper into the wood. Suddenly, the Irish spring their trap. In the tangled forest, the Vikings cannot use their favorite tactic, the wall of shields. Fighting alone, no Viking can stand against the long Irish battle axe. By midday, the Vikings flee in disorder, relentlessly pursued by Brian's men. He has avenged his father's death and made himself a warrior to be reckoned with. An even greater prize awaits Brian, the Viking city of Limerick. Rich and defenseless. Now it's the turn of the Irish to plunder.
The fortress and the good town they reduced to a cloud of smoke and red fire. All the captives were assembled. Everyone fit for war was killed, and everyone else enslaved.
On the heels of success, tragedy follows. A rival chief murders Brian's brother. Brian has lost his closest ally.
My heart shall burst within my breast unless I avenge this great king. They shall forfeit life for this deed, or I shall perish by a violent death.
True to his word, Brian pursues his brother's killers. In a remote monastery, they have taken refuge, and there he takes his revenge. In 976, Brian takes his brother's place. At the Rock of Cashel, he receives the crown of Munster. By now, Brian grasps that Ireland's greatest enemy lies within. So long as the Irish fight one another, the Vikings can never be driven out. Wearing his new crown, Brian nurses a fresh ambition to unite Ireland under his rule. Tribe by tribe, his kingdom grows. Through clever diplomacy and brutal warfare, he extends his power throughout Ireland. Entire kingdoms submit. Connacht, Meath, and his old enemy Leinster, whose king pays Brian a crippling tribute. In the year 1002, in the hills of Munster, a new summit is scaled. Brian has claimed the ancient title of Ardry, High King. Ireland now has in fact what it once had only in theory, one ruler. For the next decade, Ireland enjoys unfamiliar gifts, peace and prosperity. Brian rebuilds the churches and restores plundered treasure. He constructs roads, bridges, and waterways throughout Ireland. To ensure the coast is no longer troubled by Viking raiders, Brian enlarges his navy, based on the River Shannon. All the while, former rivals, surrendering but not submitting, bide their time. As Brian enters his 8th decade, old enemies imagine the old man weak. In 1013, the King of Leinster forges a pact with Sihtric Silkbeard, the Viking king of Dublin, and both provinces rise in rebellion. The rebels have misjudged the old man. Brian spends the winter raising an army. From all over Ireland, loyal subjects answer the High King's call to war. Brian even enlists Viking mercenaries, the finest horsemen in the land. The rebels recruit just as furiously. The Viking Sihtric Silkbeard sends for help to his brethren across the sea. Earl Surgard the Stout of Orkney, Brodar of Man. By the spring of 1014, Dublin Bay is swarming with Viking longships. It is the greatest force ever seen on the Irish seas. In Brian's camp, on the eve of battle, the old warrior speaks to his men. At dawn will come their chance to rid Ireland of the Vikings once and for all. North of Dublin, at a place called Clontarf, a Viking army beaches its ships. Here on Good Friday, 6,000 heathens face 6,000 Christians. Too old to fight, Brian pins his hopes and the command on his son Merca. Merca himself will strike the first blow. The great battle opens with a contest between champions, waged in the no-man's land between the armies. Already a great warrior, Merca now proves himself a worthy leader.
Stefan! 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 Stefan!
Gradually, the two armies draw closer. In both armies, the best warriors march in front. Shoulder to shoulder, they form a solid wall of shields. On the flanks and rear of the Irish line march the kerns, farmers by trade, soldiers for the day, hurling javelins, darts, slingshots, and stones.
They are quicker and more expert than any other people in throwing stones, and such stones do great damage to the enemy on engagement.
As the armies collide, the battle turns into a brawl. Swinging a sword in each hand, Merca strikes a great blow by cutting down a Viking chieftain, Earl Surgard the Stout. Brian sees the Viking fall, but then Merca's flag falls too. The old man's son is dead.
The two sides made a furious, smashing onset upon each other, and there arose a frightful screaming and fluttering above their heads as birds and demons awaited their prey.
All through the day, the battle rages, and the casualties mount. By evening, the Irish break through the enemy line. The Vikings flee toward their ships and safety. But this Good Friday is a black day for them. At Dublin Bay, the tide has come in. The Vikings are cut off and cut down. At the water's edge, the Vikings give up their claim to Ireland. Brian gives thanks to God for his victory. Yet in his hour of triumph, disaster strikes. In the confusion of battle, Brodar of Man and a handful of Vikings escape and stumble upon the king. Hardly believing his luck, Brodar falls upon Brian's bodyguard and cuts his way through. Before the old man is even aware, Brodar beheads him. So passed the greatest warrior and greatest Irishman of his age. When Brian's men captured Brodar, they were so enraged that they tied him to a tree with his own intestines. Brian died in his finest hour. He had united his people and rid his country of invaders. For the first time, and for the only time, all Ireland had been set free. In the Scottish Highlands, where hatreds are as old as the hills, men die easier than feuds. Where clan fights clan, only one hatred can unite them, their hatred of the English. Against the odds, a band of warriors will help Scotland win its greatest victory and deal England one of its worst defeats. As the 14th century dawns, Scotland is at war with itself. Far from king or court, men settle quarrels with the sword. Clan MacDougall has taken arms against its rival, the Campbells. Their goal, the most prized possession in this bleak land. It is a triumph for Clan MacDougall, another defeat for Clan Campbell. They have lost a herd, and with it, much wealth. As the Campbell survivor flees for home, misery is a familiar companion. Once more, his clan has been beaten by their age-old enemy, an insult they won't be quick to forget. But revenge will come sooner than they expect from an unlikely quarter. The Campbells' refuge lies in the peaks and folds of the Scottish Highlands. In the 1300s, it is a world apart. Mountains, lochs, and bogs set Highlanders off from the lowland Scots and the rest of Britain. Winters are ferocious, summers soaking. The soil sustains only the hardiest of creatures, and the people, as one lowlander complains, are as hard as the land.
The Highlanders are a savage and untamed race, rude and independent.
Even language divides the Scots. Lowlanders speak English, Highlanders Gaelic. All they have in common is a king. But to the Highlanders, marooned in their mountains, he is a distant figure indeed. For the Campbells of Argyll in the Western Highlands, their own strength is their only protection against their powerful neighbors, the MacDougalls of Lorne. United in hardship, families cling to the sturdiest rock in the land, the clan. At the heart of Clan Campbell stands Innisconnell Castle, home to their chief, Sir Neil Campbell. In Gaelic, clan means the children. Within Clan Campbell, many families live as one, sharing a common name. Even the poorest Campbell is welcomed in. Parted from his mother, he is raised in another household to ensure his ties to the clan will be the stronger bond. Into the isolated life of the Campbells, change suddenly comes when a stranger arrives. In 1307, the Campbells are stunned by the appearance on their land of a Highlander they've never seen. Robert the Bruce in name, King of Scotland, but a king who has come begging to his subjects. He is a fugitive, charged with the murder of a rival for the crown. His pursuers are his victim's kin, none other than the Campbells' old enemy, the MacDougalls. The Campbells need no other reason to help their king. Within a year, with Campbells at his side, Bruce brings weaker clans under his control. One by one, they flock to his side. By 1308, just one clan holds out, the MacDougalls of Lorne. Backed by the English, they dare defy the king. The epic poem, The Bruce, records the story.
Upon the north half of the Scottish Sea, all obeyed his majesty, except the Lord of Lorne, and those that would with him go. He ever held against the king, and hated him above all things.
With an old score to settle, the Campbell chieftain summons his men. Their ranks are swollen by broken men. Outlaws from their own clans, they have found a new home with the Campbells. Every man, Campbell by birth or by bond, will share the dangers of battle and the spoils. The summons to battle reaches the most remote Campbells. It's a 2-day march to his chief's castle, yet the Highlander travels lightly. To go to war, first he needs the plaid, bedroll, blanket, and battle attire all in one. Its deep folds offer a measure of protection from the cold and from the cold steel blade. Friend or foe might be clad in the same striped or checkered cloth. Centuries would pass before one clan distinguished its garb from another. Whatever the design, the men are clad in camouflage, the colors of the land around them. The poorest Campbells wear a lin, a plain linen shirt coated with grease or fat to make it waterproof. A small leather purse or sporran hangs from the waist. For most of the year, from his mid-thigh to his feet, the warrior wears nothing at all. In the bitter cold, Highlanders earned their lowlands nickname, Redshanks. Dressed in their plaids, the Highlanders line up for their other requirement, their weapons. Most rely on their chief's armory. Fired by the chance for revenge and a share of the MacDougall riches, the Campbells strike out into enemy territory. Lorne. Their path takes them through a wild mountain landscape, the Pass of Brander, a sheer cliff plunging into Loch Awe. Unopposed, the Campbells confidently march deeper into hostile terrain. High on the cliffs of Ben Cruachan, the MacDougalls lie in wait.
The king and his men held their way, and when the pass had entered they, the folk of Lorne on high, upon the king they raised a cry, and shot and tumbled on him stones, both great and heavy, upon their heads.
Minutes into the fight, the attackers are themselves attacked. Forewarned by a scout of the MacDougall's plan, Bruce had sent a detachment of archers ahead to scale the mountain and come up behind the enemy. The MacDougalls find themselves fighting on two fronts. As each Highlander slashes, his claymore, his great sword, is a weapon of both offense and defense. His hands are protected behind sturdy guards, sloping toward the blade. In the hands of any man strong enough to wield it, the Locharbor axe, up to 7 feet long. A Campbell hooks his foe, trips him, then turns the blade. When fighting is too close for swords, men reach for their dirk, a foot-long dagger honed razor sharp. It is the warfare of the Highlands, mastery of weapons and brute strength. The Campbells turn ambush into victory. Now they fan out across Lorne, seizing cattle and land. The rest of the MacDougalls escape south toward England. One final reward falls into Campbell hands: Dunstaffnage, the MacDougall castle. Yet the fighting has just begun, as the Highlanders brace for a greater threat. While clan was fighting clan, the English seized footholds in Scottish cities and castles. With all the clans now behind him, and the Campbells in the forefront of his army, Robert the Bruce begins to drive the English back. The Scots recapture castle after castle: Perth, Edinburgh, Roxburgh. By 1314, only one stronghold remains in English hands: Stirling Castle. Guarding the eastern frontier with England, it is known as the Key to Scotland. Clans from all over Scotland stream to Bruce's side. The Campbells are surrounded by unfamiliar faces, old enemies, even lowlanders. 6,000 strangers, united in hatred of the English. Against them, Edward II, the English king, sends a force 3 times their number. It won't be a fair fight. The English have the advantage of armored knights. The Scots can afford nothing like them. Such horses cost a fortune. Upon them rides another fortune in armor and weapons. Scottish hopes rest on supreme discipline and a simple piece of wood. It is a new formation, the Schiltron, or shield troop, a phalanx armed with shields and axes and 14-foot pikes. Even an armored horseman would hesitate to approach this forest of steel. And at full charge, horse and rider would be impaled. For weeks, the Campbells drill, learning to wheel, to reverse, to advance as one across the battlefield. A thorny hedge of defense, suddenly turns to the attack. It is a new discipline for the Campbells, a far cry from the unruly warfare of the Highlands, and a surprise for the English when they reach Stirling. When the battle opens, Scottish pikes force Edward's knights off the field and into a marsh. His horses and his attack bogged down. Camping in the marsh, Edward plans to retake the field the next day and crush the Scots under 1,000 hooves. That night, the Campbells hear a rousing speech from their king.
They have come here, trusting in their great power, to seek us in our own land, and have brought here, right into our hands, riches in such great plenty, that the poorest of you shall be both rich and mighty thereby.
He gives them a grand cause to fight for, a free Scotland, and one just as dear to their hearts, English loot. While the English sleep, the Highlanders gird for battle. At dawn, the English are still camped on the marsh, and there the Highlanders surprise them. The Campbells take their positions alongside Bruce's pikemen. To the sound of bullhorns, Bruce leads his schiltron forward. As the wall of pikes bears down, some of the English knights charge with more eagerness than wisdom. Confusion of battle, the English archers, the teeth of their army, are trapped at the rear, useless, unable to fire without hitting their own knights. The Scots drive the English deeper into the marsh, fighting on familiar soil for their own land. The Highlanders press home their advantage.
With all their might and all their main they laid on as if madmen. And such heavy blows with axes gave, that heads and helmets they did cleave. So great a din was there of blows, as weapons upon armour struck, and of spears so great a breaking, with such throwing and such thrusting, such grinning, groaning, and so great a noise that no other can beat. And war cries shouted on every side, giving and taking of wounds wide, that it was hideous to hear.
So many horses and knights lay drowned, it was said, that a man could pass over the stream called the Bannockburn without wetting his feet. When the Battle of Bannockburn was over, The lowly Highlanders and their fellow Scots had defeated the cream of English aristocracy, its knights. 700 pairs of spurs were displayed in triumph. During the entire Middle Ages, Bannockburn was the worst defeat the English ever suffered. As the Highlanders returned home, they carried with them 3 trophies: English plunder, a newfound pride, and a giant step toward keeping Scotland free. Yet the war wasn't over. "14 more years of bloodshed would pass before England would acknowledge the new king to the north, Robert the Bruce. His friends and allies, the Campbells of Argyll, would become one of the most powerful clans in the Highlands for their part in freeing a nation, Scotland.